My whole life, we've had this dusty cartoon, sitting in my parents' bedroom, staring back at me. I always knew it had my great-grandfather in it, doing something important for the military. But until now, little did I know the historical importance of his task. The year is 1942. The world is at war. The Allied powers, led by the Soviet Union, United States of America, and United Kingdom, fight against the Axis powers, the Japanese Empire, Nazi Germany, and the Italians. In the east, in the heart of the Soviet Union, the German Sixth Army battles with the Red Army for control of Stalingrad. In the Pacific, massive fleets carry fighters and bombers to huge sea battles, while U.S. Marines land on beaches such as Guadalcanal and fight bloody battles against the Imperial Army. The British Eighth Army prepares for an offensive against the Afrika Korps, and so far, the U.S. has not made a move against Germany yet. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was still popular in America, but as the army sat idle, his popularity was waning. The 1942 presidential election was coming up in November, and FDR had his eye on that. Roosevelt's generals were telling him to attack France, but British Prime Minister Winston Churchill thought the U.S. would be slaughtered there. He suggested instead to attack the periphery of the Axis Empire. Roosevelt believed that in North Africa, the French might be convinced to fight against the Germans again. This was the place they were most likely to do that. There was also pressure from the Soviets to open a second front to draw German troops away from the crucial fighting in Stalingrad.
And so the decision was made by President Roosevelt, contrary to the advice of all of his senior commanders, really, to attack North Africa, partly because there were no Germans there. North Africa was controlled still by the French, but the French were under German control.
Allied leaders had many disagreements about where to land and who should land, but Roosevelt and Churchill spelled out an ambitious plan.
And so the main objective was to seize control of the North African coast so that we would have ports and air bases for further operations against the Mediterranean.
Allied leaders, both British and American, gathered to plan what would later be called Operation Torch, an Anglo-American assault on Vichy French North Africa. Secrecy was key. They had to act fast, and this could be a problem.
There was slipshod preparation. Again, it's a very green army. It's an army with commanders who have never heard a shot fired in anger. Very few of the Americans had combat experience.
The next question, would the Vichy French fight? To find the answer, Eisenhower's second-in-command, General Mark W. Clark, was assigned to take a task force of 3 British commandos and 5 American officers. Among them, my great-grandfather, Colonel Julius C. Holmes.
A special negotiation October 2021 at a place called Cherchell in Algeria, where my dad, Julius C. Holmes, and Bob Murphy and a number of other officers met with General Mast, who is a French officer who led those troops in North Africa who were sympathetic to the Allied cause.
On October 19th of 1942, the group boarded the HMS Seraph and arrived at Cherchell on a small rowboat. After waiting for nightfall, they met with General Mast and several other French generals in a house close to the beach.
They were having a discussion in this isolated farmhouse. The idea was they were having a card game. There were bottles of wine around, and our people, my dad and the other American officers, were in uniform, because it's never healthy to get caught in civilian clothes. If you're caught in uniform, you have the laws of war protect you.
The Vichy police were alerted to suspicious activity and raided the farmhouse. The French officers pretended to be having a drunken card game. My great-grandfather and the other Americans hid in the cellar. When the police left, they quickly finished the meeting.
And then the Vichy police came back because they realized they hadn't looked in the wine cellar. So it was really touch and go. They had to race for the beach, and they lost some of their clothes on the way. But the British commandos, who had brought them ashore in two-man kayaks, were there to take them back to the submarine, and they made a safe escape.
The meeting provided crucial information to the Allies. The Navy under Vichy General Darlan could put up nasty resistance. If the army was unified under a free French general, they probably would not fight. The Allies also promised to give the French men, armor, and guns. Meanwhile, the Allied armada was on its way. The invasion began at the port of Oran on November 8, 1942. As the pessimists had warned, it was a disaster.
The unfinished Jean Bart, which was to have been the mightiest ship of France, lies smoking and in ruins from the uncanny precision of the 12-inch shells of U.S. battleships 12 miles offshore.
The French Navy fought ferociously, and one of the biggest battles of the Atlantic in World War II was off Casablanca. And while there were relatively few American casualties in that battle, there were 1,000 French sailors who died on that day.
This did not bode well for the hope that the Vichy French would not fight. In fact, they did fight, stubbornly. At one landing site, American troops were held up by sniper fire, and Casablanca resisted heavy bombardment for days. Another surprise? German submarines.
Now, they showed up right after the invasion of Morocco began, and there were a number of ships that were sunk just off the coast, and there was a pretty substantial loss of life. And that was an intelligence failure by the Americans. They hadn't realized how vulnerable the ships were in the anchorage as the landings were taking place. With a very fine admiral named Kent Hewitt, blamed himself for the rest of his life about the catastrophe that occurred in those early days.
But on land, the story was different. The city of Oran fell on November 9th, and in Algiers, 400 Free French fighters staged a coup. They met light Vichy French resistance. Meanwhile, Robert Murphy, an intelligence officer in North Africa, negotiated with Admiral Darlan to reach an agreement. In return for supreme command of North Africa, Darlan would order a ceasefire by all Vichy French forces.
The French switched sides, at least the French who were in North Africa, as part of the eventual rejoining of France to the Western Alliance. Once Torch had been successful and the landings had taken place November 8th, 1942, and the Americans and British had come ashore in Morocco and Algeria, and then eventually moved east to Tunisia and had expelled the Germans and the Italians from North Africa. Then they could take the next step, which, as it turned out, was to invade Sicily.
Operation Torch was the first time in World War II that the U.S. and Britain worked together, and it was the first major amphibious assault of the war. It was even the first U.S. airborne operation of the war, and the first time the Americans fought elite German forces. It was a climax of the United States' preparations for war and showed the true military might of the United States Army. It paved the way for Allied troops to land in Italy and eventually in France. Without the success of Operation Torch, World War II would have been longer and more deadly than it was.